Latin American economies rely on commodity exports and on non-commodity exports, and they also rely on external capital flows. So in both those contexts, the fact that the dollar is dominant in international trade as an invoicing currency and in financing capital flows makes Latin American economies particularly susceptible to their exchange rate movements relative to the dollar. So one thing that we know is that because most of non-commodity exports from Latin American economies are invoiced in dollars, you don't see much of an stimulative effect of a weakening of their currencies on exports. And most of the action works through imports. Another thing they have to keep in mind is because the prices of what they're buying are from internationally are in dollars, when their currency depreciates or weakens, that has an impact on inflation. So it's very important that monetary policy frameworks are very credible, keep inflation expectations anchored, so that the pass-through of this weaker currency into their inflation is more muted. And lastly, financial flows are also denominated in dollars, and that tends to generate a mismatch between the currency in which they have to make their payments, which are in dollar terms, versus the currency in which they earn their revenues, which is in the local currency. So when the currency depreciates, this can create financial stress. The current tensions impact pretty much all countries in the world. We've seen this as having a negative effect on investment, on business sentiment and consumer confidence, and therefore on global growth. The IMF estimated that because of the US-China trade tensions, we could reduce global growth in 2020 by 0.5 percentage points. So that's a substantial effect. Since many Latin American economies are commodity exporters, that can be a large negative effect. Second, whenever there is such an event of declining global growth, risk aversion goes up, risk sentiment goes off, and investors start pulling money out of riskier markets, and that includes emerging markets and Latin American economies. And so that can also have a negative impact on these countries. We at the fund are working on what we call the integrated policy framework, which is basically thinking about monetary policy, exchange rate policy, capital flow measures, and macroprudential policy jointly, as opposed to thinking of each of them separately, which has tended to be the case. So let's think of a simple example, which is that suppose there is a negative risk sentiment because of which capital starts going out of emerging markets. How should policymakers deal with an event like that? Now, do you decide to raise your interest rates? Do you let your currency depreciate? Do you use capital flow measures? Now, all of these policy tools are highly interconnected. When you use one, you have implications for the other. And so the point of an integrated policy framework is to think of all of these instruments jointly and to see what's the best mix of policies to use. Now, that's going to be very country dependent. It's going to depend on what kind of products do you export. Are you a commodity exporter? Are you not a commodity exporter? It's going to depend upon the level of development of your financial markets. It's going to depend upon how much do you rely on imported goods for your consumption. So these factors will matter. And the goal of the integrated policy framework is to think about optimal policy while taking into account the different conditions in different countries.